Hello, everyone. Up to this point, we've been looking at photographs mainly as singularities, as unified wholes, if you will. Even when we looked briefly at the rise of photo essays in the 20th century, these were still a set of sequence images, single images. It wasn't a film. They were just images that we looked at one after the other. Today we'll talk about a type of photography that arose out of really several art movements. But the idea of a photo montage is something that I think is very important to look at. We could say that the idea of photo montage came from an art movement called Cubism, which came around 1907 to 1914. And the most famous artists who were part of this movement, who we could say started this movement, was Picasso and Braque. Cubism is characterized by really simplified geometric forms. And the idea behind it is not to show a privileged point of view, but to show things, objects, the world through multiple points of view, sort of at the same time. This painting is almost looked at as the beginning or the beginnings of Cubism. It's Picasso's La Demoiselle d'Avignon in 1907. Basically, this is a street in Barcelona, and these are images of prostitutes. And you can start seeing sort of Cubist, beside the African masks that um, um, typify a lot of Picasso's works, you can start seeing things that become almost folded. There's the arm above the head of the woman on the left, and the way these women are, you can start seeing the forms breaking down. By the time you get to the right-hand side of the image, you can start seeing that everything is simplified. The woman with the mask on the right, her torso area and breast area has become simplified into squares almost. And once you get to the bottom, it is very difficult to find out what is the arm, what's the leg, the torso, and so on. This is sort of replicated in the other forms that are between the figures, which are almost fabric-like images. And again, this is almost origami-like. They're like folds of cloth. By the time you get to 1912, this is Picasso's still life with the chair caning. This is pretty much what people think of when they think of uh, sort of Cubism at its prime. You have this letter forms JOU, which is the beginnings of the word journal or newspaper. There's the caning from a chair that's used in a lot of cafes. This is actually a real piece of rope that was used to wrap around the image, and of course, the idea of a rectangular canvas has been broken by using this sort of oval shape. But what's important about this are you can tell the way the objects in this cafe table are basically broken down to the point of not even being able to recognize what the objects are. Juan Gris, The Checkerboard, done in 1915. Um, you can tell how much further it's broken down. Again, the idea of using typography, but using typography in a broken down form. You can sort of see the checkerboard itself, but everything else is made up of sort of bits and pieces that are almost collaged together, montaged together, if you will. Here's by Georges Braque in 1912, called Fruit Dish and Glass. So you can see, above the grapes and the word bar and ale on the lower left, but then you can see everything sort of broken down, sort of not so much falling apart, but again, the idea of being able to see everything at once. But as Cubism started to develop, this one is by Picasso Majoli in 1911, it becomes even more abstracted. The idea of simplified forms um, uh, from the visible and recognizable object to just simplified geometric forms, it's everything starts leaning more toward the latter. In terms of movement, you can see this in Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase in 1912. A lot of these things came from motion studies at the end of the 19th century, showing people in movement, motion studies by Murray and by Muybridge. But in painting form, everything is basically shown at once. It's almost this fluid motion of basically somebody descending a staircase. This type of idea of showing time and space in the previous one with Cubism is this sort of idea of seeing things instantaneously, as if the reality of something is the combination of everything all at once, the multiple views, multiple points in time represented in a single canvas. This is a famous piece by Umberto Boccioni called Unique Forms of Continuity in Space, 1913. And again, you see this, the same thing. It's basically the same as Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase, except in sculptural form, the idea of putting all time and space into one single sculptural object. In photography, we could say that one of the first attempts at this idea of multiple views came from Alvin Langdon Coburn in 1917. Here, he called these things vortographs. This one is a vortograph of Ezra Pound, the poet and the writer. So you can see Ezra Pound's face sort of broken up on the top, and everything becomes abstracted. This is almost looks like looking through a kaleidoscope. Just like a lot of things in the hyperrealism of the early part of the 20th century, where it becomes abstracted, this is sort of a different type of abstraction composed of multiple images basically put together. Here's another image by Coburn in 1917. I believe this is untitled, but you can see sort of the bicycle spokes and so on. You have an idea of these things as an object, but they start to recede in the mind as objects, and we start to accept them more as abstracted forms. This idea of photomontage comes all the way up to today. This in the 1980s, David Hockney did a series of images called what we call joiners, where he took basically photographs, a lot of them Polaroid photographs of his surroundings, of people, and so on. This would be a I believe it's a self-portrait. But the idea is that you can see him looking down, looking to the left, and so on. But the accumulation of these images creates an effect again. In this case, to create a composite of parts to create a larger, an understanding of some sort of larger whole. Here's one in the another one from the 1980s. You can also tell in this case that the camera was pulled back a little bit. The mouth is smaller. In one case at the very bottom center, and then as you go further up, it's enlarged. And it's almost as if it's like a fisheye, like a reverse fisheye lens. Here's another one. This one's composed of old Polaroid photographs. You can tell they're sort of square, and there's a room at the bottom for writing and so on. And you think of Cubism when you see this, but the idea is still the same. Showcasing several parts and breaking down what would normally be seen in a traditional sense, with a singular point of view, to speak more about the reality that's around. Because what's real isn't. I believe it was Batchin who said something like, "Things are not composed of. What makes something is not the how it's viewed from one point of view at one particular angle. It's basically this is probably closer in some ways to reality, to the thing itself, than it is to show a photographed image using a single lens from a single point of view at a single point in time. Here's another one, much larger one. And here's one that's broken down further. What's not so much in a grid form, but the idea is the same. You can see the person in the middle reading a book with a cup of coffee, but then on the other image behind it, it's showing closer up with his head leaning against his arm, and he's showing the surroundings, including the photographer himself, which you can see his hand in the foreground at the bottom, and some sort of map that he's holding as he goes around shooting all these images to put these montages together. Tomorrow we will be talking about data, which uses photomontage to great effect. That's it for now for this short mini lecture, and I'll speak to you guys tomorrow.